How many of you are familiar with the sensation of deja vu? Yeah, most of you? I feel like I have deja vu every time I walk into the kitchen and the kids have left it in a state again, which is pretty much every day. But deja vu literally means already seen. And it's a sensation that we've been somewhere before, or we've seen something before, or we've experienced something before. It's usually something that's happened in the past, and we're seeing it again in the present, aren't we? And today we're going to see the disciples having a similar experience. They've seen this before. It's not because they've dreamt it or because their neurons are misfiring in some crazy way. It's not because there's a glitch in the matrix, but because Jesus has a really important lesson for them and for us. You might remember a few weeks ago we looked at the story of feeding the 5,000, didn't we? Do you remember that? And it's a story we know well. Most of us, if we'd been in Sunday school at all in our lives, we probably would have been taught it, and maybe even at school. For some reason, the story of the 4,000 often gets lumped together with that, and sometimes people often mistake it as just a repetition of the same story. But if you look at both of the events, there's enough differences between them to allow us to know this is a totally different time. This is a totally different miracle, and it's in a totally different country. But Mark, he gives such a stark amount of detail in his description of what was taking place. He calls these details to the forefront of our minds, and he does it in such a way that we can't help but think, hang on, didn't I just read that? So you like flick back, don't you? Like, am I reading this again? Both have got big crowds. Both are in desolate places. They're in the wilderness. They've been with Jesus. They've listened to his teaching. They're hungry. And Jesus takes some bread and some fish, and he breaks it and he multiplies it to the point where there are leftovers. It feels like the exact same situation, but the thing that catches my attention isn't all of that. What catches my attention is that the disciples don't seem to notice. They don't seem to notice. Did you see the question they asked? How on earth can we feed these people with bread here in this desolate place? Does that sound like anybody else to you? Having been in the exact same question, finding themselves going back around the mountain, asking the same questions, how on earth did I get here again? We all do it, don't we? And we see that they are just asking this question, how are we going to feed these people? Don't they remember that there was 12 baskets left over last time Jesus did this particular miracle? And Tom Wright, he says that it's not a question of their memory being lacking. What's lacking is their ability to understand. I mean, no first century Jew, if we're being honest, was expecting a Messiah that would multiply loaves and fishes, was they? And it hasn't happened before. The Messiah has not walked with people before. So we can excuse them for being slow on the uptake. Thank goodness they are, because so often am I. But Mark seems to be emphasizing that feeding, as well as healing, is a way in which his identity as the true Messiah is being revealed. We need to hear that again this morning. Feeding as well as healing is the way in which Jesus is revealing his identity to the people. And so their question is not revealing a shoddy memory, it's exposing an incomplete understanding of who Jesus is. They haven't yet fully, even having sinned all they've sinned, fully comprehended who it is that they're following. And Jesus, he's about to entrust this movement to them. They're about to get promoted. He hasn't got much longer with them. And yet they still don't get it. And here's my favourite part. Jesus knows that. He knows that. He knows their understanding is incomplete. And so he calls them into a huddle. And he brings them to himself. And he's like, I'm going to teach you this again because I know you haven't quite got it. He provokes their question. He sets them up in a situation that brings their question, their incomplete understanding of who he is, to the surface. Not because he wants to berate them or belittle them or expose them in any way, not to look down on them. He calls them to himself because he wants to open their eyes. He wants to lift the veil. He wants to explode in their hearts the truth of who it is they're walking with. He wants to increase their understanding. And this morning I want to tell you that Jesus wants to call you to himself. He wants to explode in your heart the truth of who he is today. I don't know how long you've been in church. I don't know if you grew up in Sunday school. I don't know if you'd be my phone a friend on a theology quiz. I don't know all of the relationship that you have with Jesus. But what I do know is that for each and every one of us, the picture that we have internalized of Jesus is inadequate. It's inadequate. It's incomplete. Especially when we compare it to the glory of Jesus Christ. There's so much more to know. In fact, it's a lifelong journey, and we'll never fully understand who Christ is until the day we see him face to face. And so if you think this morning that you know it all, or that you've mastered it in some kind of way, the news is there's so much more to come. There's so much more to come. Jesus says, no, friends, you have yet to scratch the surface. He says, come to me. Come and be with me. And so the question for you that I have this morning is, will you come in the posture of a pupil? Are you willing to enter that huddle and learn this lesson again with the disciples today? Jesus calls the disciples to himself and he shows them two things. Jesus wants them to see the heart of the shepherd and the reach of the shepherd. The heart of the shepherd is revealed in the first few things that he says. Can you remember what they are? It's all right, it's not a trick question. The answer's in the text. Have a look. He says, I have compassion on the crowd. I have compassion on the crowd. Jesus sees them. They're not faceless masses of humanity. They're not just a mob. He sees them with a tremendous level of thoughtfulness. Jesus tunes into their needs. He's concerned about what's troubling them, and he starts to explain it to the disciples. These people have been without food for a few days. And if I send them back home without feeding them, they're going to faint on the way. Some of them live many miles from here. If you look for it, there's a picture of salvation in that. You see, Jesus sees their need and he's moved to compassion, and his compassion moves him to action. He's like, I'm not sending them off hungry. When people come to Jesus, they don't leave hungry. When people come into his presence, they're not going to leave with a good luck, mate. Thanks for coming. And so he says to the disciples, all right, what have you got? And they say, well, we've got 7 loaves, which is actually quite funny because there's 12 of them, which means 5 of them forgot their lunch. You know who you are. And probably even one of those said, well, I know Peter's going to forget, so I'll bring 2. But between the 12 of them, they've got 7 loaves. And Jesus says, okay, that'll do. And Jesus sees the needy people, and he doesn't just say, I've made a note of that. He doesn't just clock it. He feels a deep, heartfelt responsibility. Jesus sees them. The people that others may not notice, that may say, that's not my problem, that's not my issue, send them away, good luck with that, or blessings, I'll pray for you, John. But Jesus, he sees them and he feels a sense of responsibility. Jesus is never a callous observer of your pain. If you've ever felt unseen or uncared for, Jesus cares for you. He feels your anguish. Jesus is not put off by your need. He's not going to keep score like, that's the 3rd time you've talked to me today. I think you've had your quota. He has compassion. His heart is moved to action. Jesus is never too busy to be bothered by you. Jesus is never put off by your neediness. In fact, it's quite the opposite. He's attracted to it. And there's something deeply rooted in the heart of Christ that when he sees need, when he hears those simple words, I need help, he says, this is where I can shine. Jesus is not ignorant of your needs. He cares. He is concerned. When people point at you and say, not my problem, Jesus says, those are my people. And so he calls the crowd and he takes what the disciples have. And if we pause just for a minute, we see that Jesus is concerned to bring the disciples in to be part of the miracle. Do you see that? He doesn't hand the baskets out himself. He gives them to the disciples. And so they're engaged in what's going on. And for us as Christians, trying to live Christian lives, it involves us not only being fed ourselves, but in turn becoming the one through who Jesus can love others and extend that love to the world. Our resources will always feel inadequate. I never feel like I'm the right person for the job. I always feel inadequate. But that's Jesus' problem. It's not my problem. What he's asking of me is, what have you got? What's in your hand? Give it to me, and it will be enough. And he puts the people into groups. He asks them to sit on the floor. He puts them in a posture to receive. He gathers them in groups of 1500s. I mean, can you imagine that on a Sunday? He puts them in a posture to receive, and he says to them, it's all right, I don't need anything from you just at this moment. I've got it. I'm going to take care of it. And he sits them down and he takes the loaves and he gives thanks for them. He breaks them and he puts them back in the disciples' hands to give out to the people. And it says that they were satisfied. Satisfied. What a lovely word. Not hungering or desiring anything more. Satisfied. Where else do we read that word? Where do we hear that word? It's in Psalm 23, isn't it? Where Jesus is depicted as the shepherd and the heart of the shepherd who cares for his people. The heart of the shepherd cares. He doesn't just get himself educated about something. He's not just aware. No, he cares. He tends to the sheep. He meets the needs of his flock. And so Jesus' heart is filled with care, concern, and compassion for us as well. And as he hands out those baskets to the disciples, we realize there's this most beautiful image being played out in front of those people. At that time, they would have known Psalm 23. They would have known it off by heart. And Jesus is showing them, I am the shepherd. I'm the shepherd that David wrote about. I shall not want. He makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside waters. He restores my soul. He satisfies my soul. Jesus is the shepherd. And what Jesus again is revealing is that God himself in flesh has come to feed his sheep. And all who come to him shall not want, shall not hunger, will be satisfied. Does anyone else need a shepherd this morning? I do. Does anyone else need a shepherd this morning? Does anyone's soul need satisfying? Does your soul need refreshing? Do you need to be sat down and put in a posture of not striving but just receiving? The heart of the shepherd cares for you. And so after this, Jesus, he dismisses them all, and he and the disciples, they get back in the boat, and they're probably looking at each other and they're like, what did you learn? Not sure. What did you learn? I don't know. Why is it, Jesus? I'm sure we've done this before. Why is this so important? Why is he showing us this again? Why do you think he's showing them again? It's in the text. The reason is Jesus wants to entrust them with this role after he's gone. These are the sheep that they're going to be looking after. And so he's training them how to watch over the flock. He's saying this is a lesson that bears repeating. I have compassion on my sheep. Lead like me. The world needs compassionate leaders that aren't hungry for power and war, but will have mercy and love, and who will go the extra mile to meet the needs of the flock they watch over. The church needs compassionate leaders. God's people need patient, long-suffering leaders. And the disciples are learning that when you hand something to Jesus, no matter how small your supply is and no matter how small your provision is, when you give it to Jesus, when you put it in his hand, it will be exponentially more than what you started with. These disciples, they're going to be here long after Jesus' death and resurrection and ascension. And so they need to remember that the source of their ministrations wasn't what they brought to the table, it's what they received from the Lord. 7 loaves in Jesus' hands is more than enough. And when God's people rely on God's provision, they will accomplish exponentially more towards God's purposes. Last thing we glean from here is we also see the heart of the shepherd, but we see the reach of the shepherd. It says again in the first 3 words of chapter 8, it says, in those days. Trying to keep you going this morning. What were those days? What's the context of this story? Well, if we go back a few verses into chapter 7, Jesus has left the building. He's no longer in Israel. Do you remember as we saw him go over and free the demon-possessed man? He's gone out of Israel. He's now in the Decapolis. So he's in a place that doesn't really know God. In those days, Jesus was far from home. In those days when he was hanging out with pagans, in those days when he was with the Gentiles, in those days when he was with people who had no idea about the promises of God, in those days, this is what Mark is saying. We've seen him feed the 5,000. We thought this was a repeat, but here's the point. Jesus fed the 5,000 in Israel. That was a different country. That was with God's covenant people. This was his flock. But now Jesus is far from home. And now the light bulbs should be going off in your minds because you're thinking, oh my goodness, this is the significance of the the repeat of the miracle. And it's about those who are far from God. They have just experienced the shepherd of Psalm 23. Those people outside of Israel, those people who don't own an Old Testament, those people who can't even pronounce the word Torah, they are the people that are now witnessing the shepherd of Psalm 23. Even Gentile pagans are being fed as if they were part of the flock. And as we watch them eat, as we watch them be satisfied, we realize that we are they. We too are factored in, and Jesus cares for us. Yeah. Because of what Jesus is doing, because of who he is, even those people like us get to experience the Lord is my shepherd and I shall not want. Even those who are far from deserving, as possible, as far from God as they can get to experience his compassion. Everyone is invited into the fold. Not only is he a compassionate shepherd, but his compassion reaches further than you or I can ever imagine. All who come to him, regardless of background, regardless of their status, regardless of mistakes, regardless of your resume, regardless of the things you've done wrong, regardless of the labels that other people have stuck on you or put on your soul, when you come to Christ, he is here with his arms open wide and you will be satisfied. The shepherd's compassion reaches even those far from God. And Jesus is like, you need to know the reach of my compassion, because your ministry will start in Israel, but it won't end there. It'll go out to the uttermost parts of the world, and they need to understand that. That even amongst the pagans, they came into that fold, and they can have confidence that there are sheep there that need to know Jesus' voice. And it's the same lesson for us this morning. There is not a single people or community or group or country where Jesus doesn't have sheep desperate to hear his voice and receive the invitation to come back home. And so he's sending us out to the farthest reaches of society. No one is too far away. And as we finish, not only is no one far away, before you've even uttered it, he knows your need. Before you've even brought it to his attention, he knows your need. His compassion reaches further. No one who comes will leave hungry. 2 lessons: the heart of the shepherd and the reach of the shepherd. Come to him who has come for you. Let's pray.